This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. This is one of those subjects that is for everyone. You want to be ageless. I want to be ageless. We want to be 120 years old and have the look and function of a 30-year-old. Guess what? Apparently, it's not science fiction. We're not there yet. We are a little bit of time away. But we're to the point where we can imagine it. My guest today is Andrew Steele, and after receiving his PhD in physics from the University of Oxford, he shifted and decided that aging is the most important scientific challenge that we face. Because he understands that yes, today we focus on the diseases, Alzheimer's, heart disease, stroke, etc. But those are a function. Those come from aging. So why not stop the damn aging? Yeah, that's a big picture idea. When's the last time you heard a political leader talk about that? Never. So we are close. And I think you might actually have a few of those moments in this conversation where you say to yourself, damn it, I need to stop with the bad behaviors. Because if I can hang on a little bit longer, they're going to extend me. Now that's motivating as hell. Without any further delay, let's jump right into a conversation about being ageless with Andrew Steele. This is a subject, right? Isn't this the subject where, of course, everyone pays attention? You bring this subject up. I mean, maybe they will disagree with you and you can talk to me about what some of the disagreements are. But when you bring this subject up, family, friends, media, whatever, everyone wants to know, don't they?
That's exactly right. It's just everyone's got an opinion one way or the other. And I mean, I guess it's a bit like being a medical doctor. Whenever you go to dinner parties, as soon as that comes up, someone's always asking you about this rash they've got on their back is the stereotype, isn't it? And I think it's exactly the same. If you're working on a book on aging biology, then people have got questions, people have got comments, people have got really quite strong opinions. And often, I think once you sort of dig into them a little bit, you realize that people haven't necessarily thought about this stuff that much. But because it has something that's so universal, something that happens to all of us, then exactly right. Everyone's got some pretty strong opinions.
It's interesting you say that people have strong opinions. I go through your work, I jump in and I say, okay, instead of focusing on the diseases that we often get as we age, why not focus on aging as a disease? And let's see if we can mitigate aging. I can't see for the life of me what's controversial about that.
It's really fascinating, isn't it? I think that people do split into different categories, and I'm exactly the same. I had originally started out as a physicist. I did a physics PhD. I got that far before deciding that I needed to move to biology to understand this field, because as soon as I started reading about it, I just thought this is the single most consequential field of scientific endeavour, because it's got the potential to deal with all of these diverse diseases that affect us in late life, all of the biggest killers in the modern world. And for me, the logic was just inescapable. The real reason that I wanted to become a biologist was basically to see, is this plausible? Because maybe as someone who's been trained as a physicist, I'm missing some fundamental reason why this is very, very difficult, or some reason biologists haven't really tackled this to date. And basically, as I went through that, the answer was no. So there are definitely some people who've got a particular mindset who just, the logic is just obvious. But there are other people who think, oh, what about overpopulation? Isn't this going to be scary? Won't we get bored? I think it's just a mindset thing, and it's very difficult to know who will react in which way.
Just for some personal examples, sometimes I'm a fun personal example. I like to look at myself as an experiment. I'm 52. I'm not overweight or anything. I do yoga. I can do the splits. I can do handstands. I like to go run. I've got some gray showing, very, very minor down, on the sides. I tell you, sometimes I'll see folks on Facebook, and I know they're the same age. They've got a majorly expanded waistline. Their pictures all across Facebook are posing with alcohol. It doesn't look like they've slept. Before I even get into your world of what we can know about mitigating aging, I seem to think that, at least on my own personal experience, Some of these things like having exercise, eating right, avoiding the alcohol, avoiding the smoking, these things clearly have a negative effect on aging.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's something that actually really fascinated me. There's a chapter of health advice in the book. And in a way, some of it's quite basic. It's do your exercise. It's eat not too much in the right sort of things, not too much drinking. Definitely don't smoke, whatever you do. And I think the thing that understanding aging biology gives you about these fairly basic, bland sounding pieces of health advice is a fundamental understanding of the fact that they do slow down the aging process in quite a fundamental sense. And that's really an incredible thing that you've got the power to unlock. So I think that's definitely something that's worth understanding. And actually, to speak specifically to your point about looking around at Facebook posts, there really is something to the fact that people who look older are biologically older on the inside too. There was a fascinating experiment that was done in 2009 where people were shown photographs of other people and asked to guess how old they thought they were based on the picture. And they had a panel of just basically the general public trying it and a panel of expert nurses who are used to dealing with older patients. And what they found was that both groups would predict that someone who looked older, that person would then go on to die sooner or get diseases more quickly. So I think what that shows us fundamentally is the same processes are driving everything from skin wrinkling, grey hair, hair loss, that sort of stuff. All of it is being caused by the same fundamental underlying biological processes that are going on inside our bodies that are giving us cancer, that are weakening and stiffening our arteries and causing all these other kinds of problems that fundamentally go on to kill us.
Now, if you walk into the room, and this is before we start to get into some of the details that you dive into, when you walk into the room, whatever room that might be, and you start to lay some of this out, if you're dealing with an audience that perhaps has the expanded waistline, perhaps enjoys, they enjoy a good drunk, they like to smoke, they like to have fun, whatever. And they've also got an idea of what their lifespan's going to be. And they've looked at their parents and they've thought about their grandparents and they've kind of accepted it all. I guess a guy like you can cause some anger with people if people then can start to think about, well, hold on, if I can live a little bit longer, if I can give myself a few more years, that there are understandings, scientific understandings, there are therapies, etc., that are coming for sure. So it is absolutely a race. I would imagine that can cause some people to get a little bit hot under the collar, a little angry if they realize, oh my gosh, if I would have been going down a little bit smarter path, maybe I'll be around for when the advances pop upon us.
Do you know what? Thankfully, I don't think I've been exposed to anyone actually getting angry with me. And I think partly there's a bit of cognitive dissonance that goes on because obviously if you have unfortunately led a less healthy lifestyle or some people are just unlucky basically genetically or for whatever social or other reasons, they end up in a state of ill health. And some of it can just be pure luck. If you get cancer when you're 40, there's an extent to which that is literally out of your hands. And a large part of that is purely down to random chance. You can end up with a bit of cognitive dissonance. I don't think most people realize they're as unhealthy as they are. And I think that's just an inevitable fact because we don't like to think of ourselves as unhealthy or putting ourselves at any particular risk. And I guess the other thing is I try and just paint all this in a really optimistic way. The only cliche that my editors allowed to sneak into the book was the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. And I really feel like that, although it is a cliche, it's just so powerful because it's obviously not ideal. I wish I'd been a bit healthier as a teenager and, done a bit more sport. But frankly, there's nothing I can do about that now. And so the best thing I can do is start exercising, start eating as well as I can, and just try and improve my prospects from here on out because, there's just no point getting angry about the past. Just got to do what you can with the future starting now.
I concur. As I mentioned, I'm calling you from Southeast Asia, so I'm kind of surrounded by a Buddhist mindset. And yes, you're right. Living in the past doesn't help you at all. Where we are now, and that's what we got to do to move forward. Let's start to break this apart, though. Let's start to get into a little bit of the science. I'm not going to be able to keep up with you 100%, but I'm going to try a little bit at least. If you just run with it, that's fine too. Let's start to talk about aging in a way that people can understand. I know there's some hallmarks of aging that you've described: genomic instability, cellular senescence, and mitochondrial dysfunction. Let's start to break these apart. You can get as scientific as you want. You can get as detailed as you want. But let's start with genomic instability. Basically, as we age, the DNA gets mangled. It gets effed up. That's my way of saying it. Why don't I let you run with it?
I mean, that is exactly what's going on. As you probably know, inside every single one of your cells, there's a cell nucleus. And inside that nucleus, there's 2 meters of DNA. So this incredible length of this molecule. And along those 2 meters of DNA, there are these letters A, T, C, and G. And what they do is they encode how to build proteins. They're basically the instruction manual for building cells, building your body, building the stuff that sticks the cells together, etc., etc. And the problem is that, because this is an instruction manual, obviously the fidelity of those instructions is hugely hugely important to making sure that your cells continue to function in the way that they did in youth. Unfortunately, there's loads of stuff that's going on that's causing that DNA to accumulate errors. And the first kind of error you can get is something called DNA damage. And that's what happens when a particularly reactive molecule often will smash into the DNA and disrupt those letters in some way. And I think a lot of the time you think of this as being a sort of externally caused thing. It's caused by external factors. That can be things like UV and sunlight, because we know that if you get a lot of exposure to the sun, that can damage the DNA in your skin cells. Or it might be things like alcohol or the food you eat, toxins that you take in from your environment. Actually, as well as those things, I think actually even the majority of the DNA damage that you get probably comes from internal processes that are just purely a side effect of being alive. So if you think about what does being alive, it means using energy. It means we eat food, we breathe, and the oxygen in the air, basically the sugars, the energy in our food is converted into various different things that allow our bodies to go about their business. And the fact is that the reason these molecules are able to allow us to generate that energy is because they're very reactive. So by definition, they have to be reactive. They have to be capable of reacting with stuff to create that energy. And so what that means is that occasionally you might get a free radical generated by some oxygen, you might get some reactive sugars, and they can react with things like DNA, things like protein inside our cells, and that can damage the DNA. And we estimate that something like 100,000 of these DNA damage events happen inside every one of our cells every day. So it's absolutely incredible scale of destruction going on. However, luckily, the vast majority of those incidents of DNA damage are repaired because our cells have incredibly complicated machinery that can go in, they can spot these strange molecules dangling off the DNA, and they can correct those errors. However, just occasionally, one of these errors will be corrected wrongly. So, for example, one of your repair enzymes might be going through a cell and they might see a letter C that's got a particular adduct dangling off it, so a particular chemical dangling off it. And they might then accidentally misread this sort of damaged letter C, and instead of replacing it with another letter C to sort of, restore balance to the DNA, as it were, they might instead stick in a letter T. And when that change happens, that obviously means the instruction manual has an error in it, basically. There's a typo in your DNA instructions. And an awful lot of the time, this won't matter. It'll happen in a region of the DNA that isn't being used by that particular cell. Some mutations are what are called synonymous. So although there's a change in the spelling, it effectively doesn't change the meaning of the whole word. However, occasionally there will be mistakes that happen in relevant genes that are being used in that particular cell, and that can then go on to cause the cell to not work in particular ways, and that is one of the processes that goes on to cause age-related diseases.
Speaking of programming, it sure sounds like somebody programmed all this. I don't know who. I don't know who or what or how. Amazing. I mean, as you start to talk, it really does. It starts to remind me of something like the Matrix or whatnot. I rattled off the 3 hallmarks of aging. All 3 of those, are they governed? We rattled off at the very beginning of this conversation a bunch of things that can affect the aging process. These 3 things, genomic instability, cellular senescence, mitochondrial dysfunction. I want you to go into the other 2 in a second. But are they all the way that we can mitigate those 3 hallmarks from happening? The same things? Are they governed by different eating, the smoking, the alcohol? How does that translate? I mean, can we do anything in particular for these 3 hallmarks of aging?
In terms of what you can do, there's a surprising overlap. I think a lot of people realize that if you exercise, for example, that's good for your heart. And that's really intuitive because you think, you're running, your heart's going like crazy. It absolutely feels like it could be something that's benefiting your heart. But what you find is that a lot of these, as I said, fairly generic bits of health advice have impacts that are far beyond the sort of limited region in which you might think they apply. So there are certain kinds of cancer that are mitigated by exercise as well. And it's because there are various sort of governing principles that go throughout all these different pieces of health advice that work in very similar ways, regardless of the advice that you're taking. And a really good example is a process called inflammation. So inflammation is the natural process by which our bodies fight off disease and heal wounds, for example. So say you get an infection, say you get a cut on your arm, what will happen is that the cells in that area basically want to send up an alarm. They want to throw up a distress flare and call the immune system over. And what the immune system does is it gets there, it starts gobbling up any bacteria that might have made it into the wound. It starts the healing process. So inflammation is a really, really crucial part of being alive. And it's a really, really important process when it's critically acute. So what that means is when it's very sudden, when the inflammation turns on, when there's a problem, the immune cells all come over, fix the thing, and then the inflammation is turned off as soon as possible. However, unfortunately, as you get older, there's sort of an inevitable drift towards what's called chronic inflammation. And this is a constant low-level hum of sort of alert signals coming from all around the body. And this can be driven by all kinds of things. If you're overweight, the fat cells tend to contribute to that inflammation. If you get senescent cells, which I think we're going to talk about in a second, then those can contribute to chronic inflammation as well. And all of these different things can add up together. And let's take the example of cancer. The fundamental driver of that disease is DNA damage and mutations, because what happens is you need to get a cell that's accrued the relevant number of mutations in order to become cancerous. What a cancer is fundamentally is a cell that can divide an infinite number of times. It'll divide and divide and divide. It'll become a tumour. It'll get really big, and then potentially it'll metastasize and spread around your body, and that's what causes it to go on to kill you. But in order to get to that stage where it can divide an infinite number of times or metastasize, it has to accrue mutations. It has to turn off the genes in the cell that are telling it to stop dividing when it's supposed to. It has to turn on genes in the cell that cause it to grow, to proliferate continuously. That's the sort of fundamental driver. And that isn't really that much to do with inflammation. That's more to do with how fast you're accumulating this damage in your DNA and how fast those are turning into mutations. However, there is an inflammatory element to cancer. And that's because there's a second step. Once the cell has accumulated all these mutations, it's ready to go, it's raring to become a tumour. It also has to evade your immune system. So your immune system is constantly patrolling your body, looking out for these cells that have accumulated this requisite number of mutations. And hopefully, most of these things will get gobbled up by an immune cell. The immune cell will wander over, have a little look at this cell and go, oh God, something's terribly wrong here. This cell's full of damage to its DNA, and it'll just get consumed. And that means it never gets the chance to become a cancer. Whereas as you get older, not only are you accumulating all this additional DNA damage, but also you've got much greater chronic inflammation. That basically means your immune system, although it's hyperactive, it actually becomes less effective at the jobs it's supposed to be doing. And that's something you find about all this health advice. Anything that drives inflammation drives a whole variety of age-related diseases, not necessarily in a direct way, but in a way that accelerates them or facilitates them or makes them advance more quickly.
As we get older, though, as I mentioned earlier, cellular senescence, as we get older, buildup of these cells staying around the body, this just worse and worse and worse.
Cellular senescence is a really fascinating field. It's something that's really come of age in the last 10 years or so. So these cells were first discovered in a dish back in the 1960s. A guy called Leonard Hayflick was doing an experiment with these cells, and he was watching them divide. And he noticed that after about 50 divisions, they just stopped dividing. And not only that, they look weird under the microscope. I'm not an expert microscopist by any stretch, but I can identify these cells because they exhibit what's called sometimes a fried egg phenotype. They've just got this sort of bizarre shape. They look completely different to the youthful dividing cells that they come after. The suspicion was these are cells that have divided a lot of times. They look strange. They've stopped dividing. Maybe they're aged. Maybe they're senescent. They're old cells. That then raises the question, if your cells can age, is it the aging of your cells within your body that drives the aging of the body as a whole? Actually, what we've found as we've done research in the intervening decades is that basically the answer is yes. The most compelling bit of evidence for this is that you can remove these cells and you can make animals effectively biologically younger. So we've now got drugs that you can administer to mice, and then what that will do is it'll kill their senescent cells but leave the rest of their cells intact. And these mice just get younger in a variety of different ways. So the first thing is they live longer, but they're not just living longer, in decrepit frailty, it's stretching out the end of life somehow. They're living longer in good health. They get less cancer, they get less heart disease, they get fewer cataracts, they can run further and faster. They got little mouse treadmills they did these experiments on, and they even have better fur. So what this shows is that the senescent cells, this is why we call them a hallmark of aging. They aren't just driving a single disease, they aren't just driving a single dysfunction. They're driving frailty, they're driving the cosmetic changes we associate with aging, and they're also driving the diseases that go on to kill us or go on to kill mice. That's what we mean by a hallmark. We mean something that drives that whole range of different processes, and that by intervening, by killing these senescent cells, we can delay potentially the whole of aging or a significant fraction of it at the same time.
Let me keep it at the mice for a moment. Let you explain a little bit more. Give me some baselines. For example, okay, you take XYZ mouse in XYZ particular status, or whatever he's at that particular point in time, you apply XYZ treatment. What are we seeing in terms of lifespan? What are we seeing in terms of better health? Give me a little more detail about how much we're seeing our ability to control the biology of a mouse in terms of aging.
The most exciting experiment was actually one that gave these mice senolytic drugs very late in life. It gave them the drugs around 24 months, which is probably roughly 70 years old in human years, because obviously mice live much shorter lifespans than we do. What they found was they lived a couple of months extra, maybe equivalent to about 5 years in human terms. Basically, they did so, as I say, in good health. And what that means is that they deferred all of those diseases by about that same length of time. So when they did little basically mouse autopsies after they died, they found that the mice that had died a couple of months later looked basically the the same as the mice that hadn't been given the treatment that died sooner on their internals. So they had similar levels of tumours, similar levels of heart problems and that kind of thing. So it wasn't as though those senolytics were delaying one particular thing. A very common problem in mouse lifespan experiments is that a lot of mice die of cancer. It's a huge, huge fraction of the death toll. So if you can come up with some intervention that can delay cancer, you can effectively delay their death. You can make them live longer. However, what this was showing was that it covered the whole gamut of age-related diseases, basically. And then what they do is they do cognitive tests, so they can put a mouse in a maze. And what they find is that young mice tend to be quite exploratory, quite excitable, whereas older mice, they're a bit more anxious, a bit more sedentary, and they do a bit less exploration. And by removing these senescent cells, they were able to re-imbue some of that curiosity. They also do all kinds of bizarre things where they get mice to walk along a tightrope, they get them to try and balance on a rotating rod. There are all these different things that try and test their muscle capacity, their heart capacity, their coordination and balance and that kind of thing. So just this whole battery of tests, these mice are doing better on it. And even if you give them the drugs very late in life.
One last issue here, one of the hallmarks that you write about, the mitochondrial dysfunction. Let me let you give the science perspective there too before we jump into some of these larger issues.
That's a fascinating one. It's actually, I think, one of the more confusing ones in the sense that we understand sort of what's going on, but we don't know what the fundamental driver of it is yet. So let's expand on that a bit. The mitochondria, they're often called the powerhouse of the cell. So they're these tiny little, what are called organelles inside all of our cells. And what they do is they effectively generate energy. They turn the food that we consume into a molecular energy currency called ATP that can then go on to be used all around the cell for all manner of different tasks. The problem is, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the molecules that they're dealing with, particularly the oxygen, are very reactive by their very nature. And so what that means is the mitochondria are sort of ground zero for all kinds of what's called oxidative damage. They can fumble an oxygen in the sort of process they use to generate this ATP. And if they do that, then that oxygen can turn into what's called a free radical. And a free radical is a kind of chemical that can damage other chemicals that it moves around inside the cell. So it can damage proteins, it can damage DNA, and so on and so on. And for a long time, it was thought that this free radical damage was fundamentally the cause of aging. It was called the mitochondrial reactive oxygen species theory of aging. Even for decades, I think, this was the driving idea behind the aging process, because it seemed so intuitive that these free radicals, they're inevitable, they're part of being alive, there's not much you can do about them. They go around and they damage the different molecules inside your cell. And obviously, if your proteins are damaged, if your DNA is damaged, you can imagine how that impacts on the function of the cells and the function of the whole organism. So it made an awful lot of sense that that could be what's driving aging. However, what we found subsequently is actually there seems to be something a lot more subtle going on. With hindsight, it's actually not that surprising. In the 2000s, there were a lot of experiments done where they do things like they'd take a worm, these tiny little millimeter-long nematode worms that are really often used in aging research because they only live about a couple of weeks. So it means you can do your experiments much more quickly than you can with humans or even with mice. And what they found was they could delete all of the genes in the worm called superoxide dismutase. They can delete all of those genes in the worms. And that means their free radicals are basically able to run rampage throughout the cells. And what they found was the worms were suffering absolutely cataclysmic levels of oxidative damage. So they'd look inside all the cells, all the molecules, absolutely ravaged by these free radicals. But the worms didn't live any less long. What we now understand is that these free radicals are actually very important in our biology. I think my favourite example of what they're used for, they're used for signalling, they're used for all kinds of different things. But I think my favourite example is that they're used by the immune system. So when you've got a bacterial infection, for example, one of your immune cells can go over and it can basically bombard that bacterium with free radicals and kill it that way. And there are all kinds of more subtle, like, as I said, sort of signalling ideas and this sort of stuff, where these reactive oxygen species are actually used by our biology. And as I said before, with hindsight, this is kind of obvious because if you think about it, reactive oxygen species have been with life since life existed, since perhaps 1 billion years ago. And so what that means is that it'll be absolutely astonishing if biology hadn't come up with ways to deal with these strange molecules. And so what it's done is it's found ways to control them, it's found ways to basically use them for useful tasks. And so now this sort of simple idea that reactive oxygen species, that free radicals are just driving aging, has fallen a bit by the wayside. And we're left scratching our heads a little bit as to what exactly it is that causes the decline in our cellular power generators to affect the aging process. What's very clear is that we do have fewer mitochondria in older cells. Those mitochondria are often less effective at generating energy. And also the mitochondria are really fascinating because they're the only organelle, the only part of the cell outside the cell nucleus that actually has their own DNA. It's only a very short section of DNA, but they just use it to create some of their own proteins, which is very, very unusual. It's thought that perhaps damage to that DNA could be one of the things driving the aging process. Like I say, we're not 100% sure what causes it. They're definitely central because they're so important. They generate all of our energy. They control things like cell death. We just don't know exactly yet how it is that they affect aging.
Not 100% sure, and this is part of your big picture message, if we can hang along, survive a little bit longer, the science fiction aspect of increasing our longevity is right around the corner?
I think it's surprisingly close. It's almost a counterintuitively large chance of it really, really impacting on people who are alive today. I'm a scientist and I'm absolutely terrible for not wanting to put any numerical predictions on anything. What I do keep saying to people is I think this is going to happen in time for most people alive today. Although that's a bit of a cop-out.
I've seen you say 10 years.
The 10 years is for looking at things like senolytics. So I talked about those drugs in mice that can remove the senescent cells. I'd be astonished if we don't have working senolytics within the next decade. And the reason for that is they're already in human trials. And what's happening at the moment is they're being used in trials for particular diseases. There's a trial for something called lung fibrosis, which is a very common condition that affects older people. There was a trial for arthritis. There's some trials going on for age-related macular degeneration, which is a form of blindness that very commonly affects older people. And the idea is that at first, drug regulators at the moment aren't very keen to approve a drug where what it does is basically give it to healthy people and it defers their aging, but they're very happy to approve a drug that sorts out a particular disease. And so my hope is that, hopefully, fingers crossed, some of these trials will work out. There's, I think, 20 or 30 companies at the last count trying to commercialize this stuff. So there's an awful lot of effort going into it. It could even be 2 or 3 years before these drugs are being given out. And then maybe if they're safe, if they're effective, over the next 10 years, we can hopefully start to see them being given out to people who are quote unquote healthy. The only thing that's wrong with them is they were born a long time ago.
When you dive into your topic, when you dive into the topic of aging, and you look at it and think of it as a disease to mitigate or stop, it's quite amazing that in our modern society that leaders, they've got the bully pulpit. Every leader around the world can force their population to watch a show. They basically can break into whatever programming and a couple times a year at least tell people, bring people up to speed on some of the issues, for example, that you're talking about. It just seems like there is also a political element here that if you can get populations excited about something like this coming down the path, you get more people motivated, you get more people interested. It seems like a positive thing, but it's conspicuous, I guess, in its absence that this isn't happening. No one's doing this. I don't see any leaders doing this. I've never heard a leader talking about this at all. In fact, if anything, I see leaders just pretending that a lot of the assorted health problems that that are self-induced or environmental, we just excuse those or don't even talk about them as a negative thing. You see where I'm going. Where are the leaders on the front here? Okay, we can solve COVID. Okay, we can solve HIV. Perhaps we can figure out a few cancers here or there. Why not just really go after aging?
I think it's absolutely staggering. And fundamentally, that's the reason I wrote the book, because I even found this amongst biologists. I think there's a huge cultural issue across society at every possible level. To give the example of biologists, I came from a physics background, and yet what I found was that I was often teaching the biologists stuff about the biology of aging. And that's not because I'm some kind of genius who, somehow managed to master the field in a matter of years. It's because fundamentally, biologists aren't taught that in their education. If you do an undergrad, you can do a really solid biology degree from an amazing university. And if you have a lecture, you might have one lecture on the biology of aging, if anything at all, unless there happens to be someone at that university that's studying it. And I really think we need to get some kind of cultural critical mass here. Because to take the example of science, I think the problem is I had a lot of trouble finding a science job that was related to the biology of aging. And that's because there aren't many people studying it. And that sort of ends up in this vicious circle, because imagine I'd come out of my biology degree, which obviously I didn't, I did a physics degree, but imagine I was a biologist. I might do a PhD, and I might think, what should I do on my PhD in? Well, I might do a PhD in cancer, because I had a couple of really good lectures from a cancer researcher, and then there are a lot of PhDs available in that field. When I go on to become a postdoc, what am I going to do my postdoc in? Well, I've got a lot of experience in cancer. I've got a few papers that I show in order to try and get the job. So I'm going to carry on working in that same field. And when I come to start a lab of my own, I'm probably going to stick in cancer. If you look at studies, scientists do tend to continue working on the topic that they started out when they embarked on their scientific careers. What that means is that I'm going to give lectures to new undergrads about cancer. The sort of virtuous cycle for popular fields of research continues, whereas the problem for fields of research that are a bit smaller, a bit less popular, is that they tend to, sort of stick around in that unpopularity. I've sort of given this example of science because that's the one that I'm most familiar with. I feel I'm closest to. I think this just occurs throughout society. If you think of politicians, they often, when they talk about science, when they talk about medical research, they're talking about things that have affected them personally. They might have a family member who's died of a particular kind of cancer, and so they're really campaigning for that, or, whatever it happens to be. And the problem is that I think most people, that's politicians, that's policymakers, that's members of the voting public, don't see their older relatives as having died of aging. They see them as having died of heart disease, or they died of cancer, or they had some dementia and a stroke. And I think until we engineer this shift, this cultural shift, to understand that aging is the fundamental driver behind all of these things, it's going to be very, very hard to get any attention. But as we were saying right at the top of this, I think once you've got your mind into that place, and for some people that might be an instant flick of a switch, for other people it might take a bit of convincing and cajoling and understanding, I think it really is the logical conclusion of what's going on here. These are all diseases of old age, and if we want to deal with them, that is the way to do it. And I just think that by putting out that message in as many ways as possible, that's going to be the way that we make a difference here.
Well, here's a concrete way that I would love to see a leader come on TV and say, and you tell me if I'm wrong. I mean, at some point in time, I guess back in the 60s, JFK said, well, let's put a man on the moon. And so they set this big goal, and America achieved this goal. What if leaders came out and said, I would love to see a population where regular people can imagine getting to be 120 years old and have the look and function of a 30-year-old. Is that science fiction?
No, and I've never liked to put hard timescales on things. But I would be absolutely astonished if I could take a time machine to a few centuries' time and we hadn't sorted this problem. The real question is, can we sort it out within this generation, within the next generation, within the generation after that? Or are we going to sort of bumble along for centuries? And I think the sort of moonshot example is a wonderful one, because if you think back to the 1960s, in the heyday of NASA was consuming 4% or more. In fact, I think it was about 4.5% of the US federal budget. So it was a really incredible concerted effort in order to try and achieve this engineering goal. We just don't have anything like that scale of science funding now. If you look at the size of things like the NIH, National Institutes of Health, which is the public funding of medical science in the US, it's absolutely nowhere near 4% of the federal budget. And yet the potential that it's got, the huge economic ramifications, that there are these economics papers that look at how much money we could save by even slightly delaying aging. The numbers rapidly end up in trillions of dollars. They're just incredible sums of money. So there's this huge prize. Even before we talk about the humanitarian cost, all these diseases, all these people suffering for decades, there's a huge economic incentive for leaders to do this as well. I just think the mystery is why someone isn't going to stand up there and make that commitment, because even just the US going it alone could make a huge difference if they just sank some money, some resources, some effort, some passion into it.
I'm with you 100%. I'm sure everyone else is listening too, and I'm sure a lot of people are having an aha moment right now, because when I say, is it possible to imagine a person who's 120 years old with the look and function of a 30-year-old? And look, your book is not necessarily light reading, okay? There's some detail here, right? And when you immediately say to me, yes, you can imagine that, that's going to cause people to pause. That's a pause answer. That's like, what the F? Why is that not at the top of the list? All this other nonsense that we're talking about,
It's genuinely fascinating. And I think the funny thing about the book is I'm a scientist, I'm a science writer. But actually, I don't necessarily mind if you come away from the book not having understood every last single, atom and molecule in the science section. The purpose of that is to show you that this is a real serious thing, even if you don't follow every last piece. What I want people to understand is that this is genuine, actual science that's happening. This isn't some sci-fi conjecture. This is something that's happening in labs. We've got so many different ways that we can slow and reverse aging. It's a genuine possibility.
You've got a lot of different audiences, so you have to lay down, even if your audience, 95% is not going to understand everything, there's going to be 5% of critics out there that are smart folks that know everything as well. So you've got to have that detail in there to address whatever skepticism might come your way.
Definitely. And I really wanted to make sure there were just so many references in the back of the book as well, just to make sure if you are a scientist and you want to go into this, if you really want to do the nerdy stuff, there are some references that are just YouTube videos and stuff that sort of go into things in a bit more depth. But if you want to read the papers, they are there.
You brought up mice earlier and experiments and whatnot. Let me shift to another animal and let you own the table for a moment and give some insights that perhaps we've pulled from these giant tortoises on assorted islands around the world that live for 150, 175 years. What's the max that we have found some of these turtles to live?
I think the oldest turtle in the world at the moment is a guy called Jonathan. He's probably approaching his 190th birthday, so pretty old.
190. Why is that compared to us? What's going on there in the giant tortoise that they have this advantage? We might say, well, if I've got to live as a giant tortoise, that's not as fun as running around going to the beach and stuff. But I mean, hey, the giant tortoise is on the beach as well also. But give me some contrast. What's going on inside the giant tortoise that we can use or that we can learn from?
The giant tortoise, fundamentally for me, it's not necessarily going to be something that we directly look inside their cells and try and work out how it is they're living so long. What they do, and what a number of other animals around the world do as well, is they display something called negligible senescence. Let's unpack what that means. If you're a human, your chance of death doubles about every 7 or 8 years. And actually, I haven't been through these statistics in this chat yet, so I think I will, just because to me they're so shocking and they're actually one of the driving reasons that I got into aging research. I guess we all know that older people die more often. That's sort of obvious. That's something that we all come to understand. But just how much really shocks me. So if you're in your 30s, your odds of death every year are somewhere in the region of 1 in 1,000. And what that means fundamentally is if those odds were to stay the same, then you would live into your 1030s on average. So it's just, we've got this incredibly low risk of death as young adults when we're human beings. The problem is, as I said, it doubles every 7 or 8 years. And that means that's exponential growth. And we've all learned through coronavirus the power of exponential growth. So it means that, you go from 1 in 1,000 in your 30s to about 1% on your 65th birthday. There's a 1% chance you won't make it to your 66th. And then when you get into your 80s, you've got about a 1 in 20 chance that you won't make your next birthday. And if you're fortunate enough to dodge all of these still not huge chances, by the time you get into your 90s, there's something like a 1 in 6 chance that you won't make your next birthday. So it's sort of, life and death at the roll of a dice. What that means is there's this precipitous exponential increase, which it starts to hit in your 60s, maybe your 70s, and suddenly you're at this massively increased risk of disease, risk of frailty, risk of all kinds of different things going wrong with your body. But what's really fascinating about these giant tortoises is this, as I said, negligible senescence.
You would also call this biological immortality?
Exactly, yes. It's not real immortality in the sense that the tortoises obviously don't live forever, but what they do have is a risk of death that doesn't change with time, doesn't change depending on how long ago they were born. And as it happens, the tortoise's risk of death is probably somewhere in the region of 1 or 2% a year, which is why they're not living into their thousands or tens of thousands of years old. But what's more inspiring than their sort of absolute risk of death is the fact that it can be constant with time. Biologists in the past have looked around the natural world and just thought, aging is just this inevitable process of falling apart. It's something that no creature can possibly dodge. But actually, we've got a variety of different creatures now. We've got the giant tortoise, we've got naked mole rats, which are these little wrinkly rodents. There are salamanders, there are some kinds of fish, and probably far more animals that we just haven't managed to discover yet, because obviously there are loads and loads of species and only so many ecologists doing these sort of detailed demographic studies that you need in order to find negligible senescence. So what that shows to us is that not aging fundamentally isn't against the laws of biology. And I think that's a real inspiration for humans to try and go a little bit closer to negligible senescence ourselves.
Let me take it back to my example of getting to 120 and having the look and feel and the abilities of a 30-year-old. Now, of course, everyone listening is going to be in a different point in time from, somebody could be 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 90. Who knows what the exact audience demographics are going to be? Everybody is going to hear that and think, well, I want some of that. You're theorizing at the potential timeframes that might happen. Speak to how that can happen, though. Will we only be relegated to a slowing down of the aging process? So if you're already at 90, maybe you can still get to 120, but if you're at 90, you might not be able to get back to the function and feel of a 30-year-old. Or are we going to get to a point also where some of the therapies and our understandings are going to allow a reversal, actually taking things backwards in time?
I think we are going to get to reversing stuff. Senescent cells are a really good example. The strange thing about senescent cells actually is that we don't know very much about exactly what percentage of your cells are senescent in which tissues at which points of time in your life. And that's just an aspect of the fact that aging research is so underfunded, and it's particularly hard to get research budget, research money in order to study what's basically observational and sometimes considered slightly boring work where you just count numbers of senescent cells. Putting aside the fact I'm not going to give any exact numbers now, the fact is that you accumulate these senescent cells with time. You might have 0.5% of your cells in a particular organ might be senescent by the time you're 50, and 1% of them might be senescent by the time you're 65. And the fact is that if we can remove those senescent cells, say we can get it down to 0.25%, which might have been your level in your 30s or something like that, then you can say that you reversed the biological aging process. And obviously this is only one of the hallmarks, this is only one aspect of aging. But I think there's no reason why a lot of these other therapies won't be fixing damage or replacing broken stuff with new stuff or repairing things or whatever it is that will actually not just be slowing down aging, but turning back the clock.
I mean, if I was to take it to a functional example, hair, specifically men. I mean, everyone gets gray hair, but let's say men in particular, and depending on the demographic and whatnot, the hair could just eventually be gone, just falls off or, So are we looking at a point, if we were to look at something, and this is not like a, worried about my hair loss or something question, but it's just functionally to understand what could happen. Are we almost imagining the science fiction rejuvenation of like, well, here's a guy and he's 60, his hair is halfway there and he kind of looks like a box of you know what. And then all of a sudden therapy is applied and we start to have the de-aging process and all of a sudden we're all Brad Pitt, Benjamin Button. Is this truly what we could imagine?
It's a really fascinating question, actually. And hair loss in particular, it's so knotty. I literally interviewed 2 scientists who are dermatology and hair specialists to try and get to the bottom of what was driving it and how reversible it was. And I came away basically scratching my head. But nonetheless, I think eventually, and I very much hope this is the last thing we cure after we've done cancer and heart disease and all the different, other sort of more deadly and more frailty-inducing aspects of aging.
Hair is most important for men, right?
Depends on your viewpoint, I guess. But what's really fascinating about it is that we might find that stuff just gets turned back on. To talk about another way that you can reverse aging, there's this process called heterochronic parabiosis. And what that means is that it's one of the greatest euphemisms in science, I think, because heterochronic means different times, different ages, and parabiosis literally means living beside. But what it actually means is that you get 2 mice or rats of different ages. You cut open the flank of the mouse or the rat, you sew them together, and then what happens is as the wound heals, they conjoin in such a way as they share a blood supply. And what you find is that the old mouse gets biologically younger because it gets sort of some assistance from the younger mouse, and actually it affects the young mouse quite badly. The young mouse has a reduced quality of life, reduced health. To sort of focus on the older mouse for a second, the way that this works is that some of the youthful signals in the younger mouse and the dilution of some of the negative growth suppressing signals in the older mouse combine to allow it to become, as I said, biologically younger and better at healing. Some of its stem cells that were previously in a sort of suppressed state, they weren't so able to divide, they weren't so able to try and heal a wound, for example, are reawoken. And it might be with things like your hair follicles that perhaps with some of these therapies, almost as a side effect, as I said, I hope we aren't directly targeting hair first, but it might be that when we remove some of your senescent cells, when we extend your telomeres, which is another potential therapy for aging, then maybe that'll get your melanocytes, so that's the cells that generate the color in your hair, perhaps that could reverse some hair graying. It might bring the hair follicles back into activity. We just don't know in some of these cases because we don't know how all these different processes are connected. But what makes me really optimistic is, you look at the mice, and as I said, they get better fur when you remove their senescent cells. So there's a serious chance that we'll be doing something that ultimately I hope will be targeting the health of your cardiovascular system or something. But because you're intervening in these hallmarks of aging rather than trying to cure the specific disease, then it can have these wild side effects like potentially improved hair growth.
We don't want a situation where we've got an army of 90-year-olds that are all 2 seconds away from stroking out, but they've got a full head of dark hair and they look like a male model. I mean,
not ideal.
We talked early on about some of the basics, the eating right, the weight coming down, the not smoking. I want to bring up a couple others with you. I think some of these might be controversial. Some might not be well known. I am the son of a dentist. I'm also the proud winner of the 7th grade science fair for periodontal disease. Gum disease, the cleaning of the mouth. Speak to this issue. I think I've gathered and seen a little bit of research over time where they think there's some connection to the mouth care and Alzheimer's.
Understanding the aging process really does sort of throw some of the basic health advice into sharp relief, but it also exposes some less conventional bits of health advice that you wouldn't otherwise expect. Writing this book has given me a renewed passion for making sure that I've got a clean mouth, clean teeth, clean gums. The reason being that we think it might drive inflammation. So as I mentioned earlier, this process of inflammation, it's good if it's acute, it's bad if it's chronic. If you think about what happens in tooth decay, what happens in gum disease, then bacteria in your mouth are effectively attacking your teeth, attacking your gums. But unfortunately, your immune system doesn't seem to ever quite be able to get rid of them. And so what that means is this constant inflammatory process going on inside your mouth. This is sort of the explanation we now think as to why this drives the aging process. But this was first observed back in the 90s. And scientists were doing these observational studies. And what they noticed was that people who had worse dental health tended to have worse heart health as well. And this caused a lot of head scratching and actually a bit of controversy because what that seemed to scientists, it seems like a classic example where correlation doesn't equal causation. So it might just be that, for example, people who have lower incomes, they've got less money to spend on good food, they've got less money to spend on, looking after their teeth, they've got less money for their dentist bills. And so there's just this correlation. They've got poor health because they haven't got much money. They've got worse dental health for the same reason. So that means that people who have bad hearts have bad teeth. They are related, but they're not causally linked. As I said, we now understand we've got this inflammatory process that can drive aging. And so what that means is that we can, by cleaning our teeth, by getting rid of those bacteria, we can reduce that inflammation. And we know that that can improve our cardiovascular outcomes. And what's really fascinating is it might have an impact on something completely unconnected, which is Alzheimer's Alzheimer's and dementia. The first thing is that dementia, as well as being a disease of whatever it is that's going on in the brain, it's also partly a disease of inflammation. By reducing inflammation, it's probable that you can reduce the risk of dementia. The other thing that's really fascinating is that we've actually found some of the bacteria responsible for gum disease in the brains of people who have dementia. And it's not entirely clear, again, is it correlation, is it causation? Is the fact that the brain is in this deteriorated state enabling those bacteria to sneak in? The classic sign of Alzheimer's has always been thought to be these plaques. They're called amyloid plaques. As scientists have sort of picked through these plaques, what they found is entombed the bacteria from gum disease. There's a real question, is it the fact that the brain's in a state and so the bacteria are able to sneak in? Or is it the fact that the bacteria are actually getting in there and driving this disease? We don't know the answer to that question, but it's enough for me to want to try and clean my teeth and make sure I'm getting ahead of whatever problem there might be.
Seriously, right? There's probably no more practical advice that's been given on this podcast in 8 years and nearly 1,000 episodes, that as we don't know everything, but we think there could be some connective tissue to a clean mouth and Alzheimer's, your advice is, my God, if someone doesn't take that serious, I don't know, they got a death wish, right? Brush your teeth.
Yeah, it's easy. It's cheap. Do it. I mean, it even saves you money because you're not going to have as many dental bills. So it's a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned.
One that I think will be a little controversial for people, and I can remember back in the day, perhaps in high school, I was lifting a lot of weights. I would take these amino acids. I would take all these vitamins. The only thing I thought it did for me was give me diarrhea. Okay. So that was all I thought I ever got from supplements. And I've never really been a supplement guy. I think one thing I did do a little self-experiment one time. And for a while there, I kind of noticed if I took some of these fish oils, I would fall asleep. I'm not sure why that happened exactly, but anyway, speak to the idea of supplements. I mean, there is a whole army of people, and I'm sure half my audience probably is already cursing and saying this guy Coveil is an idiot and his guest today, Steele, is an idiot, and they want me to stop my supplements, and I'm spending hundreds of dollars a month at GNC, and I know they work, and they've made me more vital, and all. Who knows what they think. Your perspective, from a science perspective, from your research perspective, supplements don't waste your time. Is that the outlook?
I think basically, yeah. I mean, these things just haven't been shown to work. The thing that I find most compelling is something called a systematic review. That is the gold standard of the gold standard of medical evidence. So what's often called the gold standard of medical evidence is when you do a randomized controlled trial. So you give a bunch of people the medicine, you split them at random. So half of them are getting the real medicine, half of them are getting a placebo sugar pill that doesn't actually do anything. And then you watch them for a period of time. And that element of randomizing them into those two groups means that you can split out any differences and work out exactly what's going on. A systematic review is even better because it doesn't just look at a single randomized controlled trial. Some scientists basically search through the entire scientific literature, find every piece of work on a particular topic and pull it all together. And what they find when they do that with vitamins is that basically they don't do anything. There are a few that have no real effect on overall lifespan. There are a few that have actually a negative effect. They can reduce how long that you live. And if you've spoken to your doctor and you've got a particular vitamin deficiency, supplements can be really important. But I think for most of us, they just make for expensive urine. The sort of biological reason behind this is probably what we talked about earlier with the mitochondria. The logic behind a lot of these supplements is that they're antioxidants. And what that means is that they can basically smash into one of these free radical molecules and they can chill it out. They can calm it down before it causes a load of damage throughout the cell. But because, as we've seen, our bodies need those free radicals, they need the reactive oxygen species, it's quite likely that if you take a load of vitamin C, for example, your body's just going to end up trying to produce more of those reactive oxygen species in order to counteract that, or it might produce a bit less of its natural antioxidant enzymes in order to balance everything out again. And in fact, if you take too much of one of these supplements, one of the side effects could be that it ends up dampening down your reactive oxygen species too much and has a negative effect on your health. So overall, there's probably going to come a point where there are pills that it might be worthwhile taking every day, but at the moment, the evidence just isn't there for the ones that we have on the counter at the moment.
I got one last big picture question. If we control for men, us, being lunatics when we're young and driving our cars off cliffs and doing stupid things and all that kind of stuff, if we control for men being lunatics, where are we in terms of comparative lifespans of men and women?
It's a very difficult, fascinating question. So I talked about this mortality rate doubling time, which is the sort of scientific term for the fact that our mortality doubles every 7 or 8 years. And actually that seems to be basically the same between men and women. Men's mortality doubles at the same rate as women's mortality doubles. However, what happens is that our baseline mortality, so the mortality that we start off with, is higher than that of women. And there's to some extent that might be driven at young ages by risk-taking behaviour. Or there's also the tragedy of young men committing suicide. There's far more young men commit suicide than young women. women. And the question is that what exactly is that driven by? And I guess part of it is testosterone. But it also seems that testosterone is a kind of suicide hormone that doesn't just affect our risk-taking behavior, also affects our biology. And the reason for that might be that there's a huge advantage, biologically speaking, to gearing up for reproduction as fast as possible. In fact, this is one of the theories as to why it is that aging evolved in the first place. Because it's important if you're a man to gear up, to get your testosterone going, to be ready to have kids as quick as you can. And that means that you can have babies before you get killed by something else. And that something else, could be cancer, could be heart disease. But frankly, in the environment in which we evolved, it was more likely to be, disease or injury or something like that. So it definitely makes sense that, testosterone would ramp us up as quickly as possible, even if that comes at the cost of increased ill health in late life. And actually, there are some really fascinating observational studies that have looked at men who've been castrated. And so there are some studies that were done in the 1960s because they were looking at inmates in mental institutions. And unfortunately, back then, people who were considered mentally unstable used to be castrated. And so they had a look at some of the lifespans of those. Those are a little bit unclear, but they seem to show that castrated men live longer.
I have to say, Andrew, my audience has probably just gotten a little bit upset with me now that they think that I want to promote the removal of their testicles. But I know you're not promoting that.
Do you know what, though? I do find it incredibly bizarre because it's something that you or I could do right now. There's nothing technically, medically stopping us from being either chemically or physically castrated. And yet there's a significant chance. So I was going to mention this study of the Korean eunuchs. The Korean imperial court used to contain a huge number of eunuchs. There were these Korean scientists who looked back through their genealogical records, and they found that some of these eunuchs were living just incredibly long lifespans. There were, I think, 3 or 4 that lived to over 100 years old. And bear in mind that this Korean imperial court was around sort of in the 16, 17, 1800s. This is at a time when most people were living to the age of 30 or 40. They got these absolutely incredibly long lifespans, and yes, they were living in huge comfort, but they were living far, far longer even than the other nobles who were living in the court. Looking back at that, again, it underlines the point I was originally making about testosterone being a suicide hormone, but it does also lead you to scratch your head and think, isn't it bizarre? I don't think I'm going to get castrated. I feel like it's perhaps a step too far for my longevity, and I'd rather exercise and eat well and try and eke all the benefit out of that I can. But it is really strange that there's this idea on the table, is probably a poor choice of words, but it's available to us that we could take and potentially could make us live longer, but I'm just not quite ready for it, I don't think.
The non-eunuchs out there might be thinking, and I'm saying this somewhat in jest and somewhat with a little tongue-in-cheek, but some of the non-eunuchs might be thinking, well, the eunuchs do not have the ladies in their life, and the ladies in my life, if I'm not a eunuch, are causing me more stress. And therefore, if you're not controlling for that, that's not fair, Andrew, to just say that the eunuchs have a longer life, because we would have to look at all the issues, not just the fact that they don't have any balls.
It's a funny one, because the reason these eunuchs have these really exact genealogical records is because there is a eunuch family tree. And that might sound rather confusing because these guys were castrated in their childhood, probably around the age of 7. But actually what they did was they married and then adopted children. And those children were then castrated as well if they were male. So actually, I think they did have the women in their lives. I don't know if, perhaps their lack of balls might have made those relationships slightly less stressful in certain ways. I don't know. But there's a lot to unpack here.
There we go. It's really a fascinating subject that you've gone down. And I really do hope, big picture-wise, that this becomes something that's on the tip of the tongue of all of us, because, gosh, just talking about the diseases, in some ways, if I want to make a bad analogy, it's almost like American Civil War tourniquet amputations. If you're just only thinking about the disease that only comes from aging and not focusing on the aging itself, which is the fundamental issue, it just seems like, we just have not got to a maturity yet in really focusing on where we should be looking.
I think it's incredible. I think that the logic of this is inescapable. I say in the introduction to the book that aging is a problem that's so big it's obscured by its own enormity. And I really think that's the case. We literally have a lifetime to come to terms with the idea that we're all going to get old and die and that we're all going to get these horrible diseases. On the other side of the coin, it's very locked away from us. I haven't really interacted, although I'm aware that my grandparents have been unwell and that they've died. Thankfully, a lot of that's been behind closed doors. It's been, in hospitals, in care homes. My parents have looked after them to some extent as well. That means that you can go through such a huge period of your life without really engaging with this fact. It's a sort of background knowledge that this is something that's probably going to happen to you at some point. And by the time you're actually engaging with it, you're often quite old yourself. I think it's just a case of opening people's eyes and showing them this really obvious truth. And I think once that inescapable logic is shown to people, I really hope there's some more excitement around this stuff.
We can think back to the .com trends. We can think of the current Bitcoin trend. I can't imagine the enthusiasm that would exist for companies and products and whatnot if you could bid on those prices, if they actually had something that took the aging process in the opposite direction. Oh my God, that would be the biggest boom ever. I mean, everybody would they would put everything into that.
It's incredible. And it's like the potential market for these drugs, if they work, is every living human. And the potential amount of time they're going to be taking them is for the rest of their incredibly extended lives. In terms of medical biomedicine, if this stuff really starts to get off the ground, there's going to be so much investment. It could be the biggest industry in the world. I say in the book, it's going to be a revolution in medicine larger than the revolution when we developed antibiotics, because fundamentally it's going to treat this whole new swathe of diseases with a comparative handful of drugs. So it's going to be an absolute transformation.
The book, Ageless, the new science to getting older without getting old. That is a great subtitle. The new science of getting older without getting old, right? That really does say what the objective is, where you're going. Andrew, where can we send people? Where would you like to direct them to? They can go to Amazon and all those kinds of fun bookstores and all that kind of stuff to buy the book. But is there a website you would like to send people to?
Yeah, I mean, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Stato, so you can try and keep up with all the latest stuff and any changes that might happen subsequent to the publication of the book. I'm also on YouTube, youtube.com/Dr. Andrew Steele. So that's Dr. Andrew Steele. I'm going to be uploading some videos about aging and about the wider ethical implications and that kind of stuff. So there should be some interesting content there too, hopefully.
Andrew, thank you for educating me. Very cool stuff. I wish you the best.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.